in my mind, all bets were off. It could be a terrorist event. It could be a deliberate act by a crew member. It could be a mass failure in the electrical system.
One of the most well-known air travel disasters is the disappearance of Malaysian Flight 370. What has baffled investigators and the authorities is just how the plane could have vanished without a trace. While many theories have been debunked, a new discovery about the aircraft disaster promises to change everything. What did scientists just discover about the doomed flight, and why is everybody talking about it? Join us as we dive into scientists' terrifying new discovery of Malaysian Flight 370 that changes everything. At 12:42 a.m. on March 8, 2014, a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777-200ER took off from Kuala Lumpur and turned towards Beijing, climbing to its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Malaysia Airlines is abbreviated as MH370 was the flight number. The plane was piloted by Farid Hamid, the first officer. He was 27 years old at the time. This was his final training flight. He would soon be fully certified. His instructor was the pilot in command, Zahari Ahmad Shah, who at 53 was one of Malaysia Airlines' most senior captains. There were 10 Malaysian flight attendants in the cabin. They were responsible for 227 passengers, including 5 children. The majority of the passengers were Chinese. The rest came from Indonesia, Australia, India, France, the United States, Iran, Ukraine, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Russia, and Taiwan in that order. Captain Zahari handled the radios in the cockpit that night, while First Officer Farid flew the plane. The configuration was standard. Zahari's transmissions were a little out of the ordinary. He radioed at 1:01 a.m. that they had leveled off at 35,000 feet, a superfluous report in radar-surveilled airspace where the norm is to report leaving an altitude rather than arriving at one. At 1:08 a.m., the flight crossed the Malaysian coastline and began its journey across the South China Sea toward Vietnam. Zahari reported the plane's altitude as 35,000 feet once more. 11 minutes later, as the plane approached a waypoint near the border with Vietnam, the controller at Kuala Lumpur Center radioed, "Malaysia 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good evening, good night, Zahari." Zahari replied, 370 Malaysian. He did not read back the frequency as he should have, but the transmission otherwise sounded normal. The world has not heard from MH370 since. The pilots never checked in with Ho Chi Minh or responded to any subsequent attempts to contact them. Now, primary radar is based on simple, unprocessed pings from objects in the sky. Secondary radar is used in air traffic control systems. It is based on a transponder signal transmitted by each airplane and contains more information than primary radar, such as the airplane's identity and altitude. 5 seconds after MH370 entered Vietnamese airspace, the symbol representing its transponder vanished from Malaysian air traffic control screens, and 37 seconds later, the entire plane vanished from secondary radar. It was 1:21 a.m., 39 minutes after liftoff. The controller in Kuala Lumpur was preoccupied with other traffic on his screen and didn't notice. When he did, he assumed the plane was in the hands of Ho Chi Minh, somewhere out of his reach. Meanwhile, Vietnamese controllers observed MH370 enter their airspace and then vanish from the radar. They apparently misunderstood a formal agreement under which Ho Chi Minh was supposed to immediately notify Kuala Lumpur if an airplane handed off was more than 5 minutes late checking in. They attempted to contact the aircraft several times but were unsuccessful. It had been 18 minutes since MH370 had vanished from their radar screens when they picked up the phone to notify Kuala Lumpur. What followed was an exercise in befuddlement and incompetence. The Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center in Kuala Lumpur should have been notified within an hour of the disappearance. It still hadn't happened by 2:30 a.m. At 6:32 a.m., an emergency response was finally launched after 4 hours. The plane should have landed in Beijing at that point. The initial focus of the search was in the South China Sea between Malaysia and Vietnam. It was a collaborative international effort involving 34 ships and 28 aircraft from 7 different countries. But MH370 was nowhere in sight. Within days, primary radar records recovered from air traffic control computers, partially corroborated by secret Malaysian Air Force data, revealed that as soon as MH370 vanished from secondary radar, it turned sharply southwest, flew back across the Malay Peninsula and banked around the island of Penang. From there, it flew northwest up the Malacca Strait and out across the Andaman Sea, where it faded into obscurity beyond radar range. That segment of the flight took more than an hour to complete, indicating that this was not a typical hijacking. It wasn't like any other accident or pilot suicide scenario anyone had ever seen. MH370 took investigators in unexpected directions from the start. The mystery surrounding MH370 has been the subject of ongoing investigations and, at times, feverish public speculation. Families on 4 continents were devastated by the loss. The idea that a sophisticated machine complete with modern instruments and redundant communications could simply vanish appears implausible. It is difficult to permanently delete an email, and living off-grid is nearly impossible even when done on purpose. A Boeing 777 is designed to have constant electronic access. The plane's disappearance has sparked a slew of theories. Many are ridiculous, but all are given life by the fact that commercial airplanes do not simply vanish in this day and age. Despite Malaysian officials' reflexive denials and the Malaysian Air Force's outright obfuscation, the truth about the plane's strange flight path began to emerge quickly. For 6 hours after the plane vanished from secondary radar, MH370 maintained intermittent contact with a geostationary Indian Ocean satellite operated by Inmarsat, a commercial vendor based in London. This meant that the plane had not experienced a sudden catastrophic event. It is assumed that it remained on high-speed, high-altitude cruising flight for the entire 6 hours. Because the system's intended contents, passenger equipment, cockpit techs, and automated maintenance reports had been isolated or switched off, the Inmarsat link-ups were electronic blips, routine connections that amounted to the merest whisper of communication. There were 7 link-ups in total, 2 initiated automatically by the plane and 5 others by the Inmarsat ground station. There were also 2 satellite phone calls, both of which went unanswered but provided additional information. The majority of these connections were associated with 2 values that Inmarsat had only recently begun to log. Technical analysis indicates the plane turned south almost certainly. This is confirmed by Inmarsat's second logged value, the burst frequency offset. We will call this value the Doppler value because it includes, most importantly, a measure of radio frequency Doppler shifts associated with high-speed movement in relation to satellite position, and is a natural part of satellite communications for airplanes in flight. In order for satellite communications to work, Doppler shifts must be predicted and compensated for by airborne systems. However, the compensation isn't perfect because satellites, especially as they age, don't always transmit signals in the way that planes are programmed to expect. Their orbits may be slightly tilted. The temperature has an effect on them as well. These flaws leave noticeable traces. Although Doppler shift logs had never been used to pinpoint an airplane's location before, Inmarsat technicians in London were able to detect a significant distortion indicating a turn to the south at 2:40 a.m. The turning point was north and west of Sumatra, Indonesia's northernmost island. At some analytical risk, it has been assumed that the airplane then flew straight and level for a very long time in the general direction of Antarctica, which was beyond its range. After 6 hours, the Doppler data revealed a steep descent that was up to 5 times faster than the normal descent rate. The plane dived into the ocean within a minute or 2 of crossing the 7th arc, possibly shedding components before impact. According to the electronic evidence, this was not a planned water landing. The plane must have shattered into a million pieces in an instant, but no one knew where or why the impact occurred, and no one had any physical evidence to prove that the satellite interpretations were correct. The Wall Street Journal published the first report about the satellite transmissions less than a week after the disappearance, indicating that the plane had most likely remained aloft for hours after going silent. Malaysian officials eventually acknowledged that the story was true. Malaysia's regime was accused of being one of the most corrupt in the region. It was also proving to be secretive, fearful, and untrustworthy in its investigation of the flight. The chaos that accident investigators dispatched from Europe, Australia, and the United States encountered astounded them. Because the Malaysians withheld information, the initial sea searches focused on the wrong location, the South China Sea, and found no floating debris. If the Malaysians had told the truth right away, such debris could have been discovered and used to pinpoint the approximate location of the plane. The black boxes could have been recovered. The underwater hunt for them eventually led to a narrow swathe of ocean thousands of miles away. However, even a narrow swathe of ocean is vast. The black boxes from Air France 447, which crashed into the Atlantic on a flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris in 2009, took 2 years to find, and the searchers knew exactly where to look. After nearly 2 months of futile efforts, the initial search of surface waters ended in April 2014, and the focus shifted to the ocean depths. Although the Malaysians were nominally in charge of the entire investigation, they lacked the resources and expertise to launch a subsea search and recovery operation. As good international citizens, the Australians took the lead. The areas of the Indian Ocean that the satellite data indicated were so deep and unexplored that the first challenge was mapping the undersea topography sufficiently to allow side-scanning sonar vehicles to be safely towed miles beneath the surface. The ocean floor was lined with ridges in a blackness that had never been penetrated by light. So what are the most likely causes of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370? There are several theories as to why the aircraft vanished. One of them is that the disappearance was planned. It is impossible to believe that the known flight path, which was accompanied by radio and electronic silence, was caused by any combination of system failure and human error. None of the following can explain the flight path: a computer glitch, control system collapse, squall lines, ice, lightning strike, bird strike, meteorite, volcanic ash, mechanical failure, sensor failure, instrument failure, radio failure, electrical failure, fire, smoke, explosive decompression, cargo explosion, pilot confusion, medical emergency, bomb, war, or act of God. Second, contrary to popular belief, control of the plane was not taken remotely from the electrical equipment bay, which is located beneath the forward galley. Pages could be written to explain why, but suffice to say that control was taken from inside the cockpit. This occurred during the 20-minute period between 1:01 a.m. when the plane leveled at 35,000 feet and 1:21 a.m. when it vanished from secondary radar. During the same time period, the aircraft's automatic condition reporting system transmitted its regular 30-minute update to the airline's maintenance department via satellite. It displayed the fuel level, altitude, speed, and geographic position, as well as any anomalies. Its transmission indicated that the airplane's satellite communication system was operational at the time. Given the improbability of 2 pilots acting in concert, it's likely that by the time the plane dropped from the view of secondary radar, one of them was incapacitated or dead or had been locked out of the cockpit. Primary radar records, both military and civilian, later revealed that whoever was flying MH370 must have turned off the autopilot because the turn the plane made to the southwest was so tight it had to be flown by hand. And the circumstances indicate that whoever was at the controls purposefully depressurized the plane. At around the same time, much, if not all, of the electrical system was intentionally turned off. The reason for the shutdown is unknown, however, one of its side effects was to temporarily disrupt the satellite link. Mike Exner, an electrical engineer in Boulder, Colorado, and a prominent member of the independent group, has extensively studied the radar data. He believes the airplane climbed to 40,000 feet during the turn, which was close to its limit. During the maneuver, the passengers would have felt G-forces, the sensation of being pushed back into their seats. Exner believes the climb was done to hasten the effects of depressurizing the plane, resulting in the rapid incapacitation and death of everyone in the cabin. An intentional depressurization would have been an obvious way and probably the only way to control a potentially unruly cabin in an airplane that would be in flight for hours. The effect would have gone unnoticed in the cabin if it hadn't been for the sudden appearance of the drop-down oxygen masks and possibly the cabin crew's use of the few portable units of similar design. None of those cabin masks were designed to last more than 15 minutes during emergency descents to altitudes below 13,000 feet. They would have been useless cruising at 40,000 feet. Within a few minutes, the cabin occupants would have become incapacitated, lost consciousness, and died gently with no choking or gasping for air. The dead would have been belted into their seats, their faces nestled in the worthless oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling, and the scene would have been dimly lit by the emergency lights. The cockpit, on the other hand, was outfitted with 4 pressurized oxygen masks that were linked to hours of supply. Anyone who depressurized the plane would have simply had to slap one on. The plane was flying fast. It appeared on primary radars an unidentified blip approaching the island of Penang at nearly 600 miles per hour. The nearby mainland is home to Butterworth Air Base, which houses a squadron of Malaysian F-18 interceptors as well as an air defense radar. Not that anyone was paying attention. Another theory about the MH370 disappearance centers around the captain. Could it have been a hijacking from within that does not require forced entry by a pilot gone rogue? People may object to the idea that a pilot would murder hundreds of innocent passengers in order to commit suicide, but this is not so strange an idea. This has happened before. In 1997, a captain for the Singaporean airline Silk Air was suspected of deactivating the black boxes on a Boeing 737 before crashing it into a river at supersonic speeds. Egypt's Air Flight 990 was deliberately crashed into the sea off the coast of Long Island by its co-pilot in 1999, killing everyone on board. And just months before MH370 went missing, the captain of LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 crashed his Embraer E190 twin jet from cruising altitude, killing all 27 passengers and 6 crew members. The most recent example is the Germanwings Airbus, which deliberately crashed into the French Alps on March 24, 2015, killing all on board. Andreas Lubitz, the co-pilot, had waited for the pilot to use the lavatory before locking him out. Lubitz had a history of depression, and investigations later revealed had conducted research into the disappearance of MH370 a year before. It is, however, difficult to see the co-pilot as the perpetrator in the case of MH370. He was young and optimistic. He was reportedly planning to marry. He had no history of conflict, dissent, or doubts. He was not a German signing up for a career in a declining industry of low-cost airlines, low pay, and even lower prestige. He was flying a magnificent Boeing 777 in a country where the national airline and its pilots are still revered. But there are concerns about the captain at Zahari. The first red flag is his portrayal in official reports as above reproach, a good pilot and placid family man who enjoyed playing with a flight simulator. This is the image promoted by Zahari's family, but is contradicted by numerous indications of trouble that have been blatantly ignored. The police discovered details about Zahari's life that should have prompted them to dig deeper. The formal conclusions they reached were insufficient. Zahari's ability to deal with stress at work was rated as good. There was no previous evidence of apathy, anxiety, or irritability. His lifestyle, interpersonal conflict, or family stresses had not changed significantly. There were no behavioral signs of social isolation, a change in habits, or a change in interest. There was no significant behavioral changes observed when studying his behavior pattern on the day of the flight and the previous 3 flights on the CCTV at the airport. The appearance was consistent across all CCTV recordings, that is, well-groomed and dressed. His normal characteristics included his gait, posture, facial expressions, and mannerisms. This official report was either irrelevant or contradictory to what was known about Zahari. The truth was that Zahari was often lonely and sad. His wife had left and was now living in the family's second home. He admitted to friends he spent a lot of time pacing empty rooms while waiting for the days between flights to pass. He was also a hopeless romantic. He is known to have had a wistful relationship with a married woman and her 3 children, one of whom was disabled, and to have obsessed over 2 young internet models he met on social media and for whom he left Facebook comments that did not elicit responses. Some were hesitantly sexual. In one comment, he mentioned that one of the girls wearing a robe in a posted photo looked like she had just gotten out of the shower. Zahari appears to have become estranged from his previous well-established life. He maintained contact with his children, but they were all grown and gone. The detachment and solitude that can accompany the use of social media, and Zahari used it extensively, were most likely not beneficial. Investigators in the aviation and intelligence communities have a strong suspicion that he was clinically depressed. The FBI conducted forensic examinations of Zahari's simulator and discovered that he experimented with a flight profile similar to that of MH370, a flight north around Indonesia followed by a long run south, ending in fuel exhaustion over the Indian Ocean. Malaysian investigators dismissed this flight profile as one of the hundreds recorded by the simulator. That is correct insofar as it goes, which is insufficient. Victor Ianello, a Roanoke, Virginia-based engineer and entrepreneur who has become a prominent member of the independent group and has conducted extensive analysis of the simulated flight, emphasizes what the Malaysian investigators ignored. The one that matched MH370's path was the only one that Zahari did not run as a continuous flight, that is, taking off on the simulator and letting the flight play out hour after hour until it arrived at the destination airport. Instead, he advanced the flight manually in stages, repeatedly jumping forward and subtracting fuel as needed until it was gone. Ianello believes Zahari is to blame for what happened. Given that there was nothing technical that Zahari could have learned by practicing the act on a game like Microsoft consumer product, Ianello suspects the purpose of the simulator flight was to leave a breadcrumb trail to say goodbye. While Zahari's reasoning is impossible to understand without an explanation, the simulator flight cannot be dismissed as a coincidence. And yet, while some theories point fingers at the flight captain, others have suggested that it was hijacked by another passenger who smuggled onto the flight. The idea came about after investigators looking into the Malaysia Airlines flight's disappearance discovered a mysterious 14-stone load added to the flight list after takeoff. Ghislaine Waterloo, 54, whose wife and 2 children were on the flight, said French investigators identified the cargo in a report on the passengers and baggage. He claims that a container on the flight was also discovered to be overloaded, but no explanation was ever provided. Mr. Waterloo, who believes the flight was deliberately downed, told the French newspaper Le Parisien it was also learned that a mysterious load of 89 kilos was added to the flight list after takeoff. A container was also overloaded without anyone knowing why. It may be incompetence or manipulation. Everything is possible. This will be part of the questions for the Malaysians. This theory is supported by aviation security expert Tim Termini, who said it's highly likely that a hijack took place, and again, there's 4 options for the hijack. One is the hijack of the aircraft through a crew member. The second is a hijack coming from a passenger. A third option, which is a fairly unusual one, would be a stowaway. And then, of course, the fourth option is an electrical takeover of the aircraft from a ground-based station. However, in 2018, Philip Baum, editor of the academic journal Aviation Security International and an aviation security professor, stated that officials did not want to consider the possibility of a stowaway. He said, "I think a stowaway is a strong possibility, especially since no officials seem to want to even consider the possibility." Another theory closely related to this has been proposed by respected historian Norman Davis, who claims the flight might have been hacked and remotely diverted to a secret location. According to Davis, cyber spooks may have exploited technology designed to prevent a repeat of the 9/11 terror attacks by allowing hijacked planes to be remotely controlled from the ground. The plane was outfitted with a Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot. According to his book Beneath Another Sky, A Global Journey into History, the very existence of this technology allows for such a terrifying scenario. According to Davis, the plane may have been carrying sensitive material or personnel to Beijing and was the target of 2 kidnapping attempts. He stated that since no one has provided an answer, it is perfectly acceptable to speculate. He believes that the plane was remotely kidnapped by a hacker and then taken over by a second hacker or remote controller. Davis said the first kidnapping was by Americans who wanted to divert the plane to Diego Garcia, a U.S. naval base in the Indian Ocean, and then someone hacked it to prevent it from getting there. Another theory is linked to whistleblower Edward Snowden's revelation about the extent of U.S. surveillance. It involves the fact that 20 employees of a company called Freescale Semiconductor were on board the plane, which the Snowden document suggested could have assisted the National Security Agency in developing surveillance technologies. In response to the theory, Reddit user Dark Spectra wrote, "This group of US chip engineers working for a global leader in embedded processing solutions or embedded smartphone technology and defense contracting boarded a plane and vanished. Coincidence? And according to another theory, the doomed plane could not have sunk into the Indian Ocean because many relatives heard a ringing tone for up to 4 days after the crash. 19 families have reported that their loved ones' phones rang for up to 4 days after the plane went missing. One family member appeared on Chinese television and rang his deceased brother's phone to demonstrate that it was still ringing. Telecommunications expert Paul Franks supports this ringtone theory, concluding that the plane could not have been submerged in water. If the plane had crashed into the Indian Ocean, there is no way the phones would still ring, Franks wrote on Reddit. It isn't possible. When a phone is submerged in water, particularly seawater, it dies. Even if it did survive, it would not receive signal from the ocean's bottom. All of this indicates the plane did not crash into the sea.